Hey, so the last time I met with you, we were talking about the early goings of um, a conflict between the American colonists and the mother country, Great Britain. We talked about some of the causation, certainly that traced its roots back to the debt that the British ran up in the French Indian War. And we talked about some of the things that they were doing to reform life in the Americas that was really getting under the skin of the American colonists. Where I want to begin the conversation today is a revisitation of that Stamp Act. If you recall, the Stamp Act was really, really a big deal, and part of the reason for that is the colonists considered it a life tax. You could not avoid it. It didn't matter what you did or what occupation you were in. It taxed everything that had any sort of print on it. We recall talking about the Stamp Act Congress. And one of the things that we actually did not get a chance to talk about is one way that the Congress suggested um, implementing a protest, and that was by refusing to buy British goods. A couple things about that. What the Stamp Act Congress advocated was a boycott. Do not buy British textiles, firearms, books, metal products, anything that the British are selling over here. Another important caveat in that context would be we, as in the American colonists, just so happen to be the largest, most important trading partner that Britain had anywhere in the world. There's a lot of business that's being done there. And to make sure that everybody got the message, the Sons of Liberty, this protest movement, but really a glorified street gang, made sure that everybody knew exactly which products that they were talking about. And all the merchants in places like Boston understood you should not sell these particular types of British manufactured items. And everybody that just so happened to not agree with or let alone comply with this boycott, they had their names printed in the paper. They had the names of their shops printed in the paper. They had the names of their competitors that did not sell the British alternatives printed in the paper. And of course, there was good old fashioned intimidation for those individuals that did show up wanting to buy British made products. And so, in any case, guys, what I want you to understand is that this boycott of all British goods was very, very effective. And one reason for that was not only were we their biggest trading partner, there are a lot of British politicians, members of parliament, that were essentially businessmen. And when this boycott went down, it hit them squarely in their wallets. And this went a long, long way to getting them to rethink what they were doing with the Stamp Act. I'll come back to that here in just a second, but for a minute, I want to talk a little bit more about this guy, James Otis. We were introduced to Otis the last time we met. He was the lawyer that really took issue with British writs of assistance, proclaimed that it violated our rights as Englishmen, our right to privacy. You shouldn't be treated as a criminal unless you're really demonstrating that you are a criminal. But even with the Stamp Act, James Otis took issue with the violation of what he began referring to as natural rights. Now, natural rights was straight out of Locke's playbook, the English philosopher that has made so much of an impact on American political thought. And Locke defined these natural rights as life, liberty, and property. And James Otis said, it's not rocket science here. By taxing us like the Stamp Act and not giving us any kind of representation, essentially what you're doing is you're denying us our property. Same thing might be said for the Sugar Act. And when they say property, they don't mean like your house or, property as in land, things of that variety. What they really mean is their money. But the rub, the deep resentment for people like Otis is the fact that it's just no tax, or it's taxation without representation. And for people of this variety, James Otis and the like, this would be a violation of natural rights. And this type of rhetoric, this type of discussion continues to get tossed around, especially in places like Boston, Seaport, locations where industry and commerce were really, really important to the local economy. But back to the Stamp Act. In 1766, that boycott had really come home to roost, and in the end, the decision is gonna be made by Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. The way that I always like to think about this time period would be American colonists behaving like toddlers in a department store. You know, we're throwing a fit, we want something, we're kicking, we're screaming, we're swearing, and in the end, it'll be our British parents that will blink, give in, and appease us. That's exactly what happens in 1766. In that year, Parliament will repeal the Stamp Act, which makes us happy. But right thereafter, what they do is they implement something else. They implement a new law that on its face really doesn't do much of anything. The Declaratory Act. This might not seem like it, but this is terribly, terribly important. What the Declaratory Act does is really nothing. It doesn't tax anything. It doesn't, punish anyone. But what it says is extremely important. What the Declaratory Act says is that British law is supreme. That's sufficient for your notes, but I need you to understand what that means in the context of American colonial history. What it means, on the one hand, is all of these laws that we've been making in Boston and Jamestown and Charleston, South Carolina. They're important, but they ultimately come second. It's British law that comes first. And the other thing that it really emphasizes, this is very important, is that the British are in charge. In other words, the paradigm has shifted now. It used to be, how do we dig ourselves out of debt? And now, in 1766, it's become who's in charge. And the Declaratory Act proclaims very, very straightforwardly, the British are in charge. It is trying to get the American colonists to acknowledge that the British are in charge. Now, another lasting legacy that I need you to be mindful of would be the firing of George Grenville. The repeal of the Stamp Act is ultimately going to cost him his job, and the British are going to elect the guy that you're looking at on the screen right there, a guy named Charles Townshend. Townshend's really got his work cut out for him. I mean, not only does he need to find a way to dig Britain out of debt, there's still that looming issue, he's also got to do it in a way that the Americans acknowledge that the British have the right to tax them. The British are in charge. Keep in mind, that's what the Declaratory Act said. So he's going to do a couple things. He's going to get behind a couple measures. One would be the Townshend Act, 1767. What this will do is it'll tax consumer items. Glass, paper, ink, tea. Again, the tax wasn't terrible. It wasn't like really, really noticeable. And unlike the Stamp Act, it wasn't so obtuse and broad that everyone felt like they were being taxed just for breathing. It was much more specific, but because these items were everyday items for pretty much anybody in the colonies, pretty much everyone's going to have to pay their taxes. So once again, we're kind of back to square one. We're being taxed. We feel that this is an illegitimate law, considering nobody ever gave us any representation in Parliament. And what's worse is the Restraining Act of 1767, which says all of those local bodies that had been formed in places like Boston, they would still be allowed to exist, but they didn't really have any political power. Hence, they would be restrained from making laws and ordinances that were contrary to the British law. As you might imagine, what this does is causes a lot of conflict and controversy in the Americas, and it leads to a second boycott of British goods. Here's the thing about boycotts. They can be very, very effective. I mean, if you want to fast forward a little bit in American history, the Montgomery bus boycott in the early days of the Civil Rights Movement, this was very, very effective, primarily because they had 100% participation. If you were to look at other less than successful boycotts, part of the reason that they're less than successful is they didn't really have a lot of organization. Consequently, it didn't have as much participation as they needed. One of the things that's really essential if you're going to make a boycott stick is you need a viable alternative. And that's where the Daughters of Liberty are going to come into play. The lifeblood of the British economy, it would become the lifeblood of the American economy, would be the textile industry. Like I said before, the Americans were the largest importers of British goods, and textiles was the number one good that we imported. The problem is you can have all of these boycotts that you want. You can say you're not going to buy British textiles, but you need another viable number two. When the Sons of Liberty would host a rally, what the guys would do is what guys have been good at since the beginning of time, toasting each other, telling jokes, and most importantly of all, getting drunk. What the daughters would be doing, the Daughters of Liberty, that is, the wives, the sisters, the daughters, the nieces, they would be involved in spinning cotton into thread and weaving thread into textile. In other words, what the Daughters of Liberty were so vital in providing was an alternative to British-made textile. This gave American consumers another option and allowed more and more people to participate in the boycott, which made the boycott more and more effective. The other thing that it does is it begins, it really traces its roots to the origins of an American textile industry in what would become the United States. And as I said before, this textile industry is going to be very, very important. You'll see what I mean once we get to the era of early industrialization. But for right now, we need to talk about the British response. In 1774, in the immediate aftermath of the boycott the second time around, it's going to hurt once again, and the British are going to call it off once again. And so if you're doing the math, for the second time in under 3 years, the British have tried to make a policy stick, and they've ended up having to backtrack and repeal it. By 1769, the Townshend Acts had been repealed. The guy that will replace Charles Townshend, who will lose his job just the same way that Grenville lost his job, is a real no-nonsense kind of a guy. This is Lord North. And one of the things that Lord North does right after repealing the Townshend Acts is he sends troops to occupy the city of Boston. Why Boston? Well, James Otis, John Adams, John Hancock, Samuel Adams, what all of these guys had in common is that they were Bostonians. And what Boston was home to was some of the most radical thinkers, radical protests of the Revolutionary time period. In other words, this is ground zero when it comes to this pushback against the crown. You have to understand that nobody wanted those troops there. I've given you an explanation as to why they were so deeply resented. You were not supposed to see troops if you were not currently at war. My point in telling you this is there's an awful lot of tension. No Bostonian really liked seeing those British troops on every street corner. In March 1770, all of this is going to come to a head. Outside of a state house in what might be considered the downtown region of Boston, there's a British sentry, a collection of soldiers, and passers-by began throwing insults and later snowballs at these soldiers. Now keep in mind, these guys are armed, and they belong to the most powerful military in the history of the planet to that point. A long story short, panic, disorder, confusion, chaos, whatever it is that you want to call it, broke out, and it resulted in what we call the Boston Massacre. This is the firing of the British troops on that allegedly unarmed Bostonian crowd, and it does result in several deaths. You're seeing an image of what was supposed to be the Boston Massacre right there on the screen. I'll come back to that in a second. These soldiers are rounded up by the state militia. They're imprisoned, and they're ultimately going to be put on trial, really trial for their lives. Now, think about some really open and shut legal cases that you maybe have heard of in your lifetime. The Aurora, Colorado shooter, for example. The guy that shot up that movie theater in Colorado several years ago. There were several eyewitnesses. They all identified him. Everyone's pretty much on the same page there. However, he still got his day in court. To demonstrate that you are a nation of laws, it's important that you give people a trial, including these British soldiers. Certainly it's not going to make anybody feel very good. But if you are a nation of laws, not a nation of mobs, this is a very important part of democracy, American or otherwise. But that begs the question, can these guys get a fair trial in Boston? It's important not only that they get a trial, that it's not some mock trial, that it's a fair trial. You've got a fair arbitrator, that'd be a judge, and you also have competent legal counsel. I want you to ask yourself something. I know we seem to be drifting, but just stay with me. One of the first things that a police officer would tell somebody that they've arrested is that you have the right to remain silent. The very next thing that he or she would say was you have the right to an attorney. And after that, if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. This has a very important origin, an very important origin in American history, and that's the Boston Massacre. By trade, John Adams, political philosopher, great American founding father, very mediocre president. In any case, by trade, he was a lawyer. And one of the things that John Adams just firmly believed in is that the last thing that anybody that lived in a free country should lack would be legal counsel. And even those people that are not very popular, even those people that look pretty guilty, they deserve their day in court and competent legal advice, counsel, when they're in court. And so what John Adams does is he agrees to defend these British soldiers, even though it's not a very popular thing to do. As a matter of fact, it created quite the stir within his own family. Samuel Adams was his cousin. But anyway, John Adams is a very good lawyer, and he ultimately is able to demonstrate that these soldiers were not only provoked in their firing upon the crowd, but the firing upon the crowd was ultimately a mistake, which in general was not really their fault. He beats the case. Again, it does not make him a very popular guy, but what it does demonstrate, what John Adams' commitment to the law does demonstrate, is that America will become a nation of laws, or not a nation of mobs. This is an important concept in American political thought and the evolution of American democracy. But going back to this whole issue of where do we go from here, part of what we think we know about the Boston Massacre does trace its roots back to the image that you're looking at. And the image that you're looking at was etched, I'll come back to that in a minute, by a guy that we've talked about before, Paul Revere. His trade was a pewtersmith, metalworker, and if you wanted a visual image to be able to be reproduced again and again, this is a long time before digitalization or anything like that, you had to go to a pewtersmith who would make you an etching or broadside, kind of carve it out of metal, and you could stamp it and reprint it over and over and over again. So the guy that goes to Paul Revere and says, I want you to give me a depiction of the Boston Massacre, is our good friend Samuel Adams. And Franklin said, not Franklin, but Paul Revere says, that's great, I'd love to, but I wasn't there, that's the problem. And Samuel Adams says, well, Paul, I wasn't there neither, but let me tell you exactly how it looks like. And so together you've got Revere and Adams that are pretty much creating out of their own minds what happened on that fateful day. And if you look at that image, it looks as if the colonists are standing over there just minding their own business. Many of them are polishing their halos, and the British are firing directly into them. It's pretty clear who the good guys and who the bad guys are. Because at the end of the day, what this really was, what this broadside was a piece of propaganda. It was designed to bring other people into the movement that might be called patriotism at the time. It was designed to get people in New York to say, hey, if this can happen, if this is happening in Boston, what's to say that it's not going to happen here in New York? And so this is going to be a very powerful piece of propaganda. It's something that you've got in virtually every history book, American history book, to this day, and it will galvanize the patriot movement as we see going forward. And so the next time we meet, we're going to pick it up with the 1770s. And as you're going to see, the Boston Massacre will loom large in the minds of those people that are watching these events unfold. But for right now, that's where we're going to leave it.